yesterday. But I've already sort of introduced the way that the extended meeting ending exactly. Yesterday you were all there, and so I'm not going to say very much more about it, other than a couple of things. To me, Robert is in a sense very much the kind of ideal product of the kind of this radical stuff is aimed at, in the sense of multidisciplinarity. He's a man who kind of does across all the social sciences. We could be called an economist, a political scientist, an anthropologist, a sociologist, or not to mention a historian from time to time. So I've known him go back a very long way. Great fan and admirer for all sorts of reasons, including the ability to be so extraordinarily wide-ranging in his reach and so on. But no, not any further, Robert. Anything I missed out about you is vital. Please inform me.
Can I just check, how many of you were there last night? Was everybody there?
Yeah,
I think so. Okay. Well, let me just take off from what Akbar just said. I should warn you that I'm not a proper economist. Indeed, horror of horrors, I have no PhD in economics. I have long had a central interest in economic development, and I came from New Zealand to Sussex, to the Institute of Development Studies, to do a PhD in economics, that is, on economic development. But en route, I spent 3 weeks in India, and I decided that what I understood by economics at that time was almost completely irrelevant. So I thought, for understanding what I was seeing, experiencing, and puzzling about while I was in India for those 3 weeks, in particular, I was intrigued that there seemed to be all this energy, vitality, almost exuberance at the village level, and yet India was extremely poor, and I wondered whether anthropology might be of more use in connecting up those two observations, lots of energy apparently, and great poverty. And so without having ever studied anthropology, I announced, to the shock of my would-be economic supervisor at Sussex, that I was going to do a PhD in anthropology instead, and Sussex was flexible enough to accommodate somebody who'd never studied anthropology before. And so I did the PhD actually in Italy, but then after finishing the PhD, I went to India and I did most of my research just up the road in Andhra Pradesh, in the district of Kurnool and Anantapur, districts which are south of Hyderabad, between Bangalore and Hyderabad. And one product of this research was the book called Village Republics, subtitled Economic Conditions for Collective Action in South India. This book is about why in the same general area, same ecological area, some villages are more cooperatively organized to handle such things as common irrigation problems than has been reported in Indian village literature before. Indian village literature assumes there's no village level cooperation because caste cross-cuts territorial loyalty. And so there's no territorial-based cooperation, that's the argument. And this, my research found that some villages were more organized than had been cooperatively on a village basis than had been reported before, while other villages, maybe only a few miles away, were not at all cooperatively organized, and this was a durable pattern. It went back decades. So this book is about why, and it's addressed to the collective action theory of Mansa Olson and Elinor Ostrom and other such people. Just one more biographical point, since we're in the presence of a Nobel Prize winner. Yes?
Sorry, what was the reason?
Well, it would take me too much time. It's actually contained in this book.
Okay, I'll get it.
There's a very strong ecological basis in terms of people's response to ecological risk. So the argument actually runs against Mansa Olson's key point about the difficulties of cooperation. One other biographical point, my proudest achievement, and I tell you this because we're in the presence of a Nobel Prize winner, my proudest achievement is to win the Leontief Prize, and I wanted to take this opportunity to draw your attention to that prize and to keep an eye out for it. It's called the Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Knowledge. Leontief was a Russian-born professor of economics who spent his career at Harvard University. He died in 1999. He pioneered input-output analysis, and he worked around the proposition, the core proposition that economic growth is a function of the structure of production. If you go to development organizations today, like the World Bank, or like DFID, or like USAID, or dare I say it, like my colleagues in the Department of International Development at LSE, and you say economic growth is a function of the structure of production, they say, huh? What does that mean? This whole idea of economic growth arising out of a structure of production has just disappeared. And Leontief was the one who really elaborated on it. Our notion of development these days is poverty reduction, and that's very much a consumption-focused notion. And the appointment of Dr. Kim as the next president of the World Bank will only reinforce that kind of consumption-oriented, basic health, basic education kind of notion of development, which is right away from the idea of development as a function of the structure of production. The previous winners of this prize include, the Leontief Prize include J.K. Galbraith, A.K. Sen, Daniel Kahneman, Albert Hirschman. These four people, two of whom have won the Nobel Prize and two of whom should have won the Nobel Prize. And also it's striking, several women have won the Leontief Prize, whereas only one woman, Eleanor Ostrom, whom I referred to a minute ago, has won the Nobel Prize. And the difference may not be unrelated to the fact that the committee that decides the Leontief Prize includes several women, whereas the committee that decides the Nobel Prize includes no women, has never included a woman, and has awarded the prize to only one woman in all its history. And just finally, before I begin this talk, I want to take the opportunity to tell you one more story in addition to the one that I told you last night about Joe. And this is, I think, a very telling story. Joe began university life as a physicist, and then he switched to economics, where he was hailed as a genius because he could do the maths like that. And one day in the econometrics class, the professor set them to read and think about and come to the next class and discuss a celebrated early econometric article by Professor Brown at Oxford. And so Joe and his roommate, who was in the same class, sat down that evening to go through this article. And fairly soon Joe said, there's a mistake. There's a mistake in the maths. This maths doesn't work as written. And his roommate couldn't see anything wrong. And indeed, Joe couldn't quite figure out where the mistake was and what the mistake was. But he spent a lot of time that evening into the night puzzling over where the mistake was, what it was. He marched into the class the next day and announced that the maths didn't work. The professor said, look, I've taught this paper for many, many years. It's a famous paper. It's been taught all over the world. Nobody's pointed out a mistake. But Joe was insistent that the maths didn't work, so the professor agreed to ring Professor Brown in Oxford, and Professor Brown said, your student is quite right. There is a typographical error, and as written, the maths doesn't work. And then Professor Brown said, you know, your student is only the second person ever to have spotted that. The first was an Indian a few years ago. I think his name was Sen. So that story encapsulates Joe's brilliance. It comes out of not so much original ideas, but a very intuitive capacity in mathematics and an ability to formalize things that other people kind of know, like asymmetric information, that other people kind of know about, but haven't figured out the way to formalize it so that it can be put into mathematical models. Okay, so let me begin on this subject.
You have to name the.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe you want to. Yeah.
Okay. So this then is my. Oops. That's the subject. I'm going to begin with a very common set of ideas that you hear in all kinds of manifestations. And there are two propositions, basically. One is that the world is shifting in terms of the economic center of gravity. This is often referred to as the rise of the South, or more accurately, the rise of the East. So that's proposition number one. And proposition number two is that this shift in the economic center of gravity, or the rise of the South, the rise of the East, is being translated into greater influence of developing countries, some developing countries, in global governance organizations such as the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. And I'm going to question both these two propositions, and I want to go rather quickly over the first one, because the kind of evidence for the first one, the first proposition, is more familiar to you as students of economics. The kind of evidence that I use for the second proposition will be less familiar to you, and therefore I want to spend a bit more time on it. The world has become more multipolar. That's another way to translate the idea of the rise of the South. And this greater economic weight of the South is being translated into influence. That's the political proposition. Of course, for some people, this is very good news. It's the payoff from decades of globalization. We are moving into a world with increasing multipolarity, that's the economic part of it, with multilateralism, that's the political part of it. And one standard example of this translation of greater economic weight into more political influence is the creation of the G20 in 1999 at finance ministers' level in the wake of the East Asian crisis. And secondly, the elevation of the same set of countries to leaders level, heads of government level, in 2008, again in the wake of a crisis, namely the Great Western Financial Crash. So things are changing politically as well as economically, is the bottom line message. I said that this is good news for some. Of course, it's bad news for others. And I love this quote from a WikiLeaks cable. The cable refers to the group called the Basics. The Basics is different from the BRICS in the sense that the Basics drop Russia, but it's otherwise the same countries. And so this is from the senior US official for the G20 process, the official known as the Sherpa. That is the head of the US officials who do the work of the G20 for the US. It's remarkable how closely coordinated the basic group of countries have become in international fora, and this I put in italics, taking turns to impede, can you imagine that? Our good initiatives, and playing the US and the EU off against each other. This is outrageous behavior, and we have to do something to stop it, is the implication. So my argument is that this familiar set of propositions is exaggerated at both ends. The economic rise of the East or the South is mainly the rise of China, and secondly, that the political influence of these countries, all of these countries, including China, is greatly exaggerated in international fora. Western states, this is the key point, Western states continue to lead across the whole gamut of international organizations, and they try and marginalize those which they don't lead and which take a different position on international issues to that of Western countries, such as, for example, UNCTAD. I hope I'll have time to come back to UNCTAD. However, that being said, it is also true that some DCs, that's developing countries, have become more assertive in global governance than they were before, but assertive in terms of defending what they regard as national interests. And the result is an increasing pattern of stalemate in international organizations. So that the world order you could describe is rather than multipolarity with multilateralism, it's closer to what you could call mini-polarity, especially bearing in mind that this is the main exception, the main country that's risen. Mini-polarity without much multilateralism, or as somebody has described it, we are in a G0 world, not a G7, not a G20, but a G0 world in terms of effective cooperation. Just let me remind you, this book was all about why villages up the road in Andhra Pradesh cooperate or don't cooperate, and so I'm in a way just extending the argument of this book to the global level. So I'm going to quickly run over some evidence on the rise of the East. Then I'll talk about some case studies of economic organizations. Perhaps I'll talk about one involving centrally Joe Stiglitz, and then some conclusions. In terms of the rise of the South, we can have a number of measures. I mean, the conclusion that one comes to depends partly on the measures that one uses. And so here are a set of measures. Because I want to go over this part of it, the first part of it rather quickly, I'm not going to go through this point by point. I'm rather going to just run over these slides. This is the beginning of the development problem. This shows average income in Western Europe and Western offshoots. These are Western offshoots. Western offshoots means the United States, or North America, Australia, New Zealand. And this is 1600, 1800, 2000. So this is Western Europe taking off from Asia, from Africa, Latin America, after 1800, and Western offshoots taking off from Western Europe. And then much later on, these beginning to go up. So this is the beginning of the development problem, just to put the whole thing in longer perspective.
Sorry, Robert. How does this compare with Madison? I thought Madison had a much later period.
The short answer is I don't know, and I don't want to get into it. This is Darren Asimoglu and Jim Robinson's chart. And this shows the absolute income gaps between various regions. This is the United States, this is Western Europe, and these are the developing countries, 1990, 2000, 2006. Growing absolute gaps. This is a bit difficult to reconcile with the idea of the great rise of the South. Oops. Boy. Okay, this is really I think, very dramatic, these set of charts. They show the percentage for each country, the percentage of its GDP of world GDP, and from 1980 through to 2010. Both in market exchange rates, that's the solid line, and in purchasing power parity. And the basic point is that the only country that really goes up dramatically is China, from, say, roughly 2% in 1980 through to, in purchasing power parity, something like 13%, or about 9% or so in market exchange rates. India certainly goes up, but not by that much, and in terms of market exchange rates, hardly at all. But then look at these other so-called rising developing countries, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, and they're pretty flat all the way through. So, so that's one point. If you look at this particular measure, the share of the big emerging market countries in world GDP from 1980 through to today, you don't see a dramatic increase, with the major exception of China and the minor exception of India. And the second point is that in terms of capital markets, this is another kind of measure of the rise of the South. In terms of capital markets, the West and the US in particular continues to dominate international capital markets in a very big way. So that also should not be forgotten. When various countries went into crisis after 2008, they went running to the US Federal Reserve to get swap agreements. It was the US Federal Reserve that could set the terms on which it gave out those swap agreements, underlying the central power of the US central bank in global capital markets. This is one of the main pieces of evidence that's used to support the idea of the rise of the South or the rise of the East. And it shows growth rates from 1980 through to 2010, 1980, 2010. This line is the growth rate of OECD members across that time, so declining quite markedly from 2000 onwards. And at the same time, growth rates of middle-income countries and also low-income countries go up markedly. So this is historically unprecedented, that middle and low-income countries are growing that much faster than the OECD countries. Before that, they were growing at relatively similar kinds of rates. And much has been made of this to support the idea of the rise of the South. Of course, there's a question of what it is that has produced such a divergence in growth rates. It's partly the decline of the OECD members, as distinct from if they had continued across. But even if they had continued growing like this, there would still be a very large growth rate gap. The question is, how sustainable is that? Sanjay Reddy is talking, he's not here now, but he's talking this afternoon, and he's done quite a lot of work showing how volatile is the growth experience of developing countries across time. There's not much correlation, for example, between decadal growth rates. Countries that grow fast in one decade may well grow slow in the next, and the volatility is much greater than in the case of the developed countries. Yeah, I'm going to... Yeah, actually, I'll draw your attention to just one point here. Something very dramatic has been happening, and that is that we have, for the first time, a situation in which there is no longer a strong correlation between the size of a national economy in terms of total GDP and the per capita income of that economy. Previously, when the G7 ran the world, there was a strong correlation. The G7 economies were the biggest economies, and they had the highest per capita income, take out some oil exporting exceptions. But now that is beginning to break down with the rise of China and India into the top 10 or top 15 economies, because they are coming in into the top economies in terms of total size, but they are very poor. I mean, China is still somewhere around about number 80 in terms of per capita income. India, of course, is much lower than number 80. So this breakdown of the correlation between size of GDP and per capita income is very important, I think, politically, because the countries that are coming into the G20 to sitting at the top table on account of the sheer size of their GDPs are bringing very divergent interests in. They are much more concerned about things like poverty than was, for example, the G7. So this does represent a real change in global politics. Okay, and this is the final slide I'll talk about in this first part of the talk, and it's related to the question of how sustainable is this increase in growth rates in the middle and low-income countries. This slide, I think, is rather dramatic. It shows, first of all, the time period is 1991 through to more or less today. It shows the average return on assets, this is across Latin America, in two sectors. One, automobiles, electronics, machinery. So this is the core of the manufacturing sector. And then secondly, mining. And no doubt agriculture might be rather similar to mining. And you see what happened. That is that the rates of return in the two sectors, manufacturing and mining, were roughly similar from 1991 through to about the early 2000s. And then this huge gap began thanks to exports to one country, which was China. Latin America was exporting massive amounts of mineral products, iron ore and so on, to China. China was processing them and exporting the products to the US and Europe. While meanwhile, the returns to manufacturing, the core driver of a widespread, widely diffused development process, languished. So resources were pulled out of manufacturing into mining, into agriculture, sectors, for example, that have little employment, and the employment they have is mostly unskilled employment, taking resources from sectors where labor is more skilled. That, I think, is one kind of indicator that this very substantial step up in growth rates of developing countries since the early 2000s may not be sustainable. It may be quite fragile. Okay, so let me come up to the second part that I wanted to spend a bit more time on because it's less familiar to you. I'm always distressed about how uninterested most economists are in what I'm going to talk about. And I think that that's a real shame. You should be applying your analytical techniques to these questions of global governance. So the first point is this, or the general point rather, is that from the 1990s and the 2000s, Western states continued to dominate global governance, and Southern states took very little by way of initiatives at the global level. And this isn't just a kind of general impression. This is based on a recent study published in the Handbook of Transnational Governance. I think it's called the Handbook of Transnational Governance, edited by David Held and Thomas Payne, 2011. And this is what they did is this: they studied more than 50 transnational institutional innovations, and they found a pronounced north-south governance gap. The innovations that they studied, including things like, for example, arbitration bodies, the innovation of the World Bank's inspection panel, which I know a great deal about from the inside, by the way, if any of you are interested in it. Not very complimentary to the inspection panel, I have to say. Multi-stakeholder bodies such as the Global Polio Foundation, the Marine Stewardship Council, the World Commission on Dams. These were the kind of things that they studied, 50 of them. And the point is that none of the innovations of those 50 can be described as a Southern-led initiative. Northern actors have driven institutional innovation, whether they be states, NGOs, corporations, or Northern-dominated international organizations. This is the reference, Held Handbook on Transnational Governance, 2011. Okay, actually before I come to the G20, I'm just going to quickly summarize the story about Joe Stiglitz, since he's rather central in your being here. And this concerns what happened in 2009. 2009, the President of the UN General Assembly, so not the Secretary General, the President of the UN General Assembly, who is elected by the membership for a one-year term, and in this case, in 2009, he was a Nicaraguan, a former priest, a suspended priest. I've never managed to find out why he was suspended, but he was the President of the General Assembly, and he was very concerned to use his time to rejuvenate the General Assembly, to get it to be a more central kind of debating forum in global governance. So he seized on the global economic crisis that had begun in dramatic form in 2008, and he said, we, the General Assembly, need to have a serious high-level conference about this crisis, and we need, first of all, to appoint a commission, a high-level commission, to write a report about the crisis, the causes of the crisis, and what the world, the General Assembly, should be recommending to steer out of the crisis. And he asked Joe Stiglitz to be the chair of this high-level commission, and Joe then enlisted his friends and acquaintances and so on, and appointed them to be members of this commission. Well, the US and especially the UK, that is the two states that have been the only two hegemons for the past 150 years. We've had only two hegemonic states for the past 150 years. First the UK, then the US. The representatives of the UK and the US at the UN went ballistic, and they said, over our dead bodies, this is not going to happen. And it went to the point where Sir John Sawyers, who was then the UK ambassador to the UN, and who is now, not incidentally, the head of MI6, which is the British intelligence service, he asked the British Foreign Office to contact all the members, and by telephone, by the way. The Foreign Office rang up all the members and individually tried to persuade each of them to resign from the commission on the grounds that this would surely be very bad for their professional reputation. None of them resigned. Some of them were amused, but more of them were very angry. And so what happened then was that the high-level General Assembly debate was actually held to discuss the report, despite the opposition of the US and the UK. But then the US and the UK made it their business to ensure that there was no follow-up. Or rather, since all UN conferences are required to have some follow-up, it's written in the rules for UN conferences, there must be a follow-up. So the US and UK couldn't block it completely, but they did everything possible they could to ensure that really, in effect, nothing happened. So the next thing was that the incoming president of the General Assembly was from Libya, and he was close to, remember this was in 2010, was close to the Gaddafi government. Well, Sir John Sawyers, who knew that he was going to be the head of MI6, offered him a deal. The deal was that you drop the Stiglitz Commission, that is, you do nothing to follow up the Stiglitz Commission. He had promised, as a condition of being president of the General Assembly, that he would follow up the Stiglitz Commission. But then Sawyers offered him the deal. You drop the Stiglitz Commission, and we will ensure that you and your relatives are spared the fate that is going to happen to the Gaddafi family in Libya. And so the Libyan, thought this was a pretty good deal. He wasn't too worried about the Stiglitz Commission. And so that's what happened. He didn't do anything. And basically, to cut this long story short, what happened was there was a very low-level follow-up meeting at the UN in May of 2012. So years later, a very low-level meeting, almost nobody came. It got no press attention. You will not have heard of it. I have not heard of it. And that was exactly what the US and the UK wanted. The more general point being made here is that the US and the UK were saying all the way through, the General Assembly shouldn't be worrying their little minds about the global financial crisis. It should be handled by the G20 and the IMF. And not incidentally, the G7 countries dominate the G20 and the IMF. So those are in a way that they don't dominate the General Assembly. So with that background, if you get the opportunity, you might like to check that story with Joe, because I have not actually checked what I've just said with Joe. I've got my account from quite different people. Okay, so this now, the next case study. Let me just remind you, I have a PhD in anthropology, and anthropologists are defined as social scientists who believe that the plural of anecdote is evidence. The plural of anecdote is evidence. So I really like these case studies. And so my next case study is of the G20. As I said, the G20 was established in the wake of the East Asian plus Latin American plus Russian plus long-term capital management crisis in 1999. At the finance minister's level, it was very clearly the initiative of the West, of the G7 to be more exact, and to be more exact still, I'll tell you how the members of the G20 were selected. This is a very interesting question because these 20 countries, or to be more exact, the 19 countries plus the EU, it's significant. There's only one regional organization represented, I mean, as a full member. Why the EU? Why not the African Union, for example? But this is how it happened. How did those 19 countries and the EU get selected? Well, at that time, 1999, Timothy Geithner, who now, of course, is the US Treasury Secretary, was the Under-Secretary underneath Larry Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary. In the German finance minister, the top official working for Eichel, the finance minister, was none other than our mutual friend, Akbar and my mutual friend, Kaio Kochweiser, who had been a managing director at the World Bank, was one of McNamara's proteges, and then had left the World Bank and become the top official for international affairs in the German finance ministry. And these two people, Timothy Geithner in Washington, Kaio Kochweiser in Berlin, had a number of transatlantic telephone calls. They each had in front of them a chart of all countries of the world with their GDP, their population, and their trade, and so on and so on. And they simply went down the list, saying, for example, Argentina. It came to Argentina, and Timothy had had instruction from Larry Summers that Argentina must be included. The reason was that the Argentinian finance minister had been Larry Summers' roommate at Harvard some 20 or 30 years before. And so they were bosom friends. And Larry told Timothy that, of course, Argentina must be included at the top table of countries that are globally, systemically important. And so Australia also, which happens to be a close US ally, of course Australia had to be in. I'm from New Zealand, so of course I view the inclusion of Australia with some skepticism in terms of, is Australia a systemically important, globally systemically important country? Question mark. They went down the list. Spain, no, because, and Poland, no. Nigeria, no. Egypt, no. South Africa, yes. And so on. And they added up. They got 19. They, from the beginning, wanted to include the EU. They got 19, and then they added up what share of world population, or no, actually population didn't count, what share of world GDP these countries represented, and so on. And they said, well, this is a pretty representative set of countries. We've got all the big ones. And so then they sent their list to the other G7. The other G7 approved it. And that's how those 19 countries plus the EU came to be assembled at the top table of global governance. And then, as I said, it was upgraded to leaders level in the wake of the 2008 crisis. And when it was upgraded, it was intended to become something like the equivalent of the UN Security Council, but for economic and financial matters, but also without the authority to actually order things to be done that the UN Security Council has. It had to operate more indirectly through arms like the IMF and the World Bank. That is, if the G20 agreed that something should be done in the World Bank and the IMF, then the G20 members who sat on the boards of the IMF and the World Bank could translate what the G20 had decided into what the boards of those organizations should decide. If you're following me, you should immediately see that this constitutes a major, major problem of illegitimate government, because the governing bodies of the US, of the World Bank and the IMF have a well-established legitimacy. And yet here they are being, in a sense, possibly overruled, but certainly steered by a body that is a self-appointed club whose membership meets no rational criteria, in the sense that you cannot reverse engineer those 19 countries. This is the important point I wanted you to get. If you take those 19 countries, you cannot find a formula, like a certain formula weighing GDP, weighing whatever else you like, which will produce those 19 countries as the most systemically important countries. For example, you cannot get Argentina in with any kind of formula. It's only because Cavallo was Larry Summers' roommate. Nor can you get Australia in. However, despite these problems, this G20 has been heralded as a major step forward in global governance. This is Sarkozy. Sarkozy never missed an opportunity to exaggerate, and he said the G20 prefigures the planetary governance of the 21st century. If this is true, then we are in for a really bad time. But on the other hand, for reasons that I've already implied, the 182 UN members who are permanently excluded, this is a club whose membership is exclusive. You're either in or you're out permanently. There's no mechanism for changing the composition. And so many of these 182 UN members see things differently. And my favorite is now the former Norwegian foreign minister who said the G20 is the biggest setback to international relations since World War II. I've been trying to get through to him to do an interview, but he's rather reluctant, for reasons I don't understand, to do an interview. Anyway, so my bottom line is that the G20 lacks what I call input legitimacy. That is, it lacks legitimacy on the representational side. Who gets to sit at the table? Why? And then secondly, it lacks output legitimacy in the sense that apart from the first 6 months or so after the first meeting in late 2008, there were 3 meetings in the first 6 months. And you can argue that they were pretty effective in coordinating in those first 6 months, because this was when everybody was in a cognitive fog about what on earth to do about this crisis. But in the several meetings, 4 or 5 meetings since then, they managed to achieve very little except photograph opportunities, or photo ops as they're called, for the leaders. And I was struck by reading this article, A Group in Search of a Mission, by Thomas Pickering and David Hannay, a senior American and senior British official, in the Herald Tribune at the end of November, A Group in Search of a Mission. This article is about the G20, and their point is that the G20 lacks a mission, and what it must do is find a mission. But this extraordinary thing, it's not extraordinary actually, because nobody raises the question I've been raising, namely the legitimacy of the G20 itself. They never question the right of those 19 countries to be at the top table. They never question that. So this is my argument, that the G20 is not viable. I mean, going forward 5, 10, 20 years, it's not viable as a top coordinating forum. But the world does need such a top coordinating forum on the economic and financial side, akin to the UN Security Council. And so the proposal is, and I've written this together with a Danish collaborator in the excellent journal I wish to draw your attention to, the journal called Global Policy. You can get it online very easily. Global Policy, September 2012, I and my Danish colleague have written a paper called Establishing a New Global Economic Council. And this involves abolishing the G20, shock. This new Global Economic Council would have a legitimate constitutional foundation. One of its criteria must be that its members, that is the people who are sitting at the table, must represent all the world's countries, rather than just represent themselves as is present. So countries should be grouped into constituencies, and the seats, the people sitting at the table, should represent constituencies of countries in a way similar to that of the present constituency system in the World Bank and the IMF. One of the troubles with the present system in the World Bank and the IMF is that 8 countries represent only themselves, and then all the other countries are represented by the 25 minus 8 seats, other seats around the board. The board has 25 seats, and 8 represent only themselves, so the balance are representing constituencies of countries. In the case of Africa, at least until recently, the African executive directors at the board of the World Bank, they were representing 28, 30 countries each. How can somebody represent 28 or 30 countries? It's a complete nonsense. So one of the criteria for the composition of the new Global Economic Council is that the constituencies must be much smaller, but everybody at the top table must be representing more than just themselves. And the suggestion is that the Global Economic Council, the World Bank and the IMF would have the same constituencies, the same ones. And then there's a question, what criteria should be used for allocating seats and for allocating votes? Very difficult questions. For example, if population is used, and some people, it will be no surprise to you that India is very keen on this, let's argue that a heavy weight should be given to population. India's got the 2nd biggest population in the world, in terms of seats and in terms of votes. GDP, there's a question about how GDP would be measured. Would it be measured at purchasing power parity? Would it be measured at market exchange rates? A big difference between those two things. Would it be measured as a blend between market exchange rates and GDP? If so, what is the weighting? If it's a weighting 60% market exchange rate, 40% purchasing power parity, that favors the developed countries. If it's the other way around, 60% purchasing power parity, 40% market exchange rate, that favors the developing countries. So you can see how complicated these kind of things are. There's a question about what the Global Economic Council would actually do. And one suggestion we make is that it appoints the heads. It should appoint the head of the World Bank and the IMF in an open process, a complete contrast to the present process, which I think I may come back to in a minute, about the World Bank. So but the point is, if this Global Economic Council was empowered to appoint the heads of the IMF and the World Bank, and indeed even appoint the head of all the UN organizations, then it would have real power. Then people would go there, not just to have a photo opportunity, but they would take its business seriously. At least this is the argument that can be made. There is a question, though, about what would be the mission, what would be the mandate of this body. And I'm really going to leave this now, but with a question to you. If you were designing such a body, how would you do it? What sort of weight would you give to regional representation? What sort of weight would you give to population, to GDP, and so on? You can see my answers in this article in Global Policy. Okay, yes, and that's the reference. I'll leave this PowerPoint, by the way, with whoever is in charge of PowerPoints for this workshop. Really? Okay, so this now brings me to the bridge between what I've been just talking about and this next case study. The question is, how did Dr. Kim come to be the next president of the World Bank? Well, ever since the beginning in 1945 or so, the president of the World Bank has always been an American, just as the head of the IMF has always been a European. That's the gentleman's agreement. It's not in the Articles of Agreement, it's not in the Constitution, but it's a gentleman's agreement that that is the case. And the president has always, the World Bank, has always been approved unanimously, that's an important word, by the Board of Executive Directors, even in the case of Paul Wolfowitz, the board had very, very serious doubts about the American nomination of Paul Wolfowitz, but nevertheless, formally, it was declared as unanimous appointment by the board. And then, in 2012, another American was appointed, but for the first time ever, not unanimously. And this is the backstory. When the position was opened, that is, Robert Zellick, announced that he would not seek a second term. He announced it because Obama had told him he wasn't going to get a second term anyway. Then immediately two very well-qualified developing country candidates came forward. One was popularly known as Ngozi. She is the current Nigerian finance minister. She had been a former managing director at the World Bank. So she is very well placed in these kind of activities. And the second one was Jose Antonio Ocampo, and who, by the way, won the Leontief Prize in the same year that I won it, 2008. We won it together. Ocampo had been finance minister of Columbia, and of course he teaches with Joe at Columbia University now. So there were three candidates, Ngozi, Ocampo, and Kim. Practically everybody, I think even I can drop the qualification, everybody agreed that Ngozi and Ocampo were far better qualified than Dr. Kim. Dr. Kim was a medical doctor at the Harvard Medical School who had very little experience in developing countries. That which he had was in Haiti and Rwanda, where he had been involved in primary health care and especially in fighting AIDS. And he'd worked in the WHO on AIDS programs. But he had no development, broader development experience whatsoever. And I've got in a paper, yes, I'll mention another really good journal to keep your eye out on, and that's the journal Challenge. It's an economics journal, but it's if you will, a kind of popular economics journal, though the people who write for it are very serious people, but they write in language, in English, which is intelligible to a wide readership. I write quite a lot for it, I have to say. And I have a paper coming out in the January issue on all this, and I give some rather choice quotes from people who interviewed both, all three candidates, what they had to say about Dr. Kim. The common view in Europe was that Dr. Kim would make a good executive director of the World Bank, as distinct from president. Executive director is a rather low status these days in the World Bank. So by saying he would make a good executive director, it was really a thumbs down. Okay, so this is what happened. 2 days before the board of the bank met to vote, the G11 met. The G11 is the informal name for the group of executive directors. Remember, these are civil servants representing countries. These are not officials of the World Bank. These are civil servants. So the G11, representing developing countries, met for quite a long time to discuss the issue. And at the end, they had an unofficial ballot, which came out 11 for Ngozi and 0 for Kim, because Ocampo had already withdrawn. When the board came to vote, 2 days later, only 3 executive directors, the 3 from Africa, voted for Ngozi, and they voted for her because the African Union, heads of government, had supported Ngozi, so they couldn't go back on that. But all the others that had only 2 days before voted for Ngozi had switched their votes in those 2 days. And so it's interesting to ask, what happened? Well, what happened was, first of all, people, including the 8 executive directors from developing countries, saw that given that the US had supported Christine Lagarde as the new managing director of the IMF just a few months before, when Dominic Strauss-Kahn had to abruptly resign for reasons that we could but should not go into. There's much more to that story than is generally known. as soon as the US supported Christine Lagarde, it was guaranteed that Europeans would support whoever Obama nominated. Obama could have nominated his butler or his dog, and they would have supported that nominee as president of the World Bank, because they, in a sense, they hold each other hostage. If the US defects and does not support a European for the IMF, the Europeans can threaten to not support the US for the president of the bank. Together, they have enough votes to ensure that their candidates will always win. And so that's the first thing. The developing country executive directors realized that there was such a, it was so unlikely that Ngozi was going to be elected, given this relationship between the US and the European Union, that they thought they should not anger the US. And so they decided to support Dr. Kim in order not to anger the US, because Dr. Kim was going to be elected anyway, so they may as well run with it. But it wasn't quite as simple as that. When this meeting took place before the board vote, and 11 voted for Ngozi, almost certainly quite a number of those people did not actually support Ngozi. What they were doing by saying that they would vote for Ngozi was to increase their bargaining leverage, their individual countries' bargaining leverage with the US. So what happened in the 2 days was that Timothy Geithner and the other US Treasury officials got through, rang the capitals of these executive directors, and they began to strike the deals. Well, with China, the deal was very, very clear. The Chinese had long been interested in having the top position of the IFC. IFC is the International Finance Corporation, which is an arm of the World Bank, but it's the arm that deals with private companies, deals with private foreign direct investment. China is very interested in getting an influence in foreign direct investment law, both incoming to China and outgoing from China. And it thought that getting the head position in the IFC would be a good place in which to do that. So China, when the US Treasury offered the position head of the IFC to China, China said it would change its vote in favor of Dr. Kim. I'm sure there's more to the story than just that, but that was a large part of it. And indeed, Dr. Kim's appointment was announced in June, and in August, the head of the IFC, the new head was announced as a Chinese national. India, almost certainly the appointment of Kaushik Basu as chief economist, not him specifically, but the fact that he is an Indian national was related to the fact that India changed its vote in favor of Dr. Kim. So these are the kinds of deals that go on and help to swing this decision in favor of Dr. Kim, even though, and this is the main point, for years there has been a chorus. Everybody said that these positions should be open to international recruitment without nationality restrictions. Everybody has agreed with that norm. And on this occasion, there were two good candidates, very well qualified candidates, but despite both these 2 points, the outcome was the same as the previous outcomes all the way back to 1945. But the story I've told you shows you something of the sort of inner politics, which is what I'm interested in, as to how these things actually happen. And then, of course, this result is surely going to affect the thinking of the World Bank. And that's another thing I'm interested in, how these organizations think, how they change their minds. Because the president is an important signal man, like a railway signal or a switch man in a railway system, the man that pulls the levers to make the trains go this way rather than that way. The president has an important role in deciding the broad direction of what the World Bank says about development and what it doesn't say. So this is an important appointment. What I don't have time to go into is why the US nominated specifically Dr. Kim rather than anybody else. That's an interesting story too. And it again relates to this point that I made last night. The head of a very senior American banker saying recently, quoted in Time magazine, America is a good example of crony capitalism. Everything depends on who you know and how big your financial donation is. And that is partly what lies behind the selection specifically of Kim by Hillary Clinton and by Timothy Geithner. So, do I have, how are we going for time?
Not as much as we would like to. Depending on which time want to give the question.
Okay, I can summarize the case of the Chiang Mai initiative. This might be a bit closer to some of your interests than what I've been talking about. This means that I will not be able to talk about one of my favorite cases, which is what has been happening in UNCTAD. UNCTAD being the think tank for developing countries, the UN agency that has most articulated the views of developing countries, and which the West has gone all out to close down or at least to marginalize. And I was involved on the edge of those negotiations in Doha in April. If any of you are interested in UNCTAD, then I'd be more than happy to talk about that. Anyway, so let me just say something about the Chiang Mai initiative. Chiang Mai, the city in Thailand where this whole agreement started in 2000 in the wake of the East Asia crisis. We call it here in the West the East Asia crisis, but in East Asia it's commonly known as the IMF crisis. The IMF crisis, because people are so angry. This is an important point for the story. People are so angry at what the IMF did. The IMF, directed by Larry Summers at the US Treasury, came in and really twisted the arms of Korea, of Thailand, of Indonesia, Philippines, twisted their arms to do a whole lot of things that the US Treasury had long wanted them to do by way of structural reforms, to open up to US firms, using the crisis as a pretext. And basically, the IMF, it's quite scandalous, the IMF just complied with what Larry Summers and the others of the US Treasury wanted it to do by way of putting conditions on its emergency lending into East Asia. That's why it's called the IMF crisis. And in the wake of the crisis, East Asians